Let's be brutally honest right now. That's a big question.
I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to go to base camp, but they want to go to the very top.
Whether it's here, India, New York.
Civilization was born at happy hour.
That's what wins. That's what stands out. That's what people are interested in. That's what I want to know. The Hospopreneurs Podcast with James Henderson. Hello and welcome to episode 128 of the Hospopreneurs Podcast. Nicolas Georges is an innovator and system thinker leading Koko Black through major transformational change. Challenged in his first year of leadership by a global health pandemic and business lockdown, Nick's previous FMCG and retail experience was put to the test. Before Koko Black, Vitasoy Australia and Baker's Delight, Nick had already spent 15 years with Nestlé in Europe and then time with Kraft Foods and Mondelez in Australia, where he helped spearhead the $2 billion multinational to become one of the most innovative food manufacturers in the country. He then joined Monash University to create the Food Innovation Centre, where he remains an adjunct professor in chemical engineering. Folks, so that we can keep the lights on, there's a company I'd like to share with you. It's called Access Collins. Their revolutionary booking and inquiry management software for hospitality is helping operators increase foot traffic, maximise revenue, and tackle no-shows. So if you're looking for a table management and inquiry management system, please do check them out at theaccessgroup.com.au. Now let's get into the show today. Hello and welcome to the show, Nick.
Hi, James. Thanks for having me.
Anytime. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program today, Nick. You've been working with Koko Black for a little while now as well and taken the business through two very interesting changes, one after the receivership of the business and another CEO ran the company. You've come in since and then been hit with COVID. So I can only imagine the sort of things that you've had to deal with over the past few years. So I'm excited to open the interview with you. But the first question that I like to ask on the show is a crazy hospitality story, or you can answer an exceptional hospitality experience and what that is defined by to you.
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting question when I was trying to reflect on it, because obviously we are a business that goes across a number of channels, and we've got our own stores, we've got a cafe lounge in it, and we also work with a number of corporate clients. So either service these needs or we actually do some of it ourselves. What is a crazy story? It's probably the one that sticks in my mind was when we've designed the native chocolate range that we had and essentially got into Northern Territory with Daniel Motlop, the former football player who's actually got a business in native ingredients. And I can remember walking into that, it was on a restaurant in the hotel before we went out to see the ingredients and actually look at a table full, and I'm talking a 4 or 5 meters long table covered with various raw ingredients that were directly coming from the land and that I've never heard or seen before, and that were used really traditionally in the cooking by either Aboriginal community or a lot of the Australian chefs who are now really bringing this taste to us. I actually remember just that tasting session of experiencing this as you would through, say, a range of different dishes that you would probably do normally, and just get my mind blown up by tastes and textures and sensations that I've never experienced before. Yeah, so sometimes you think about these experiences as something more traditional or more in the sense of how it was put together and cooked and presented for you in hospitality, where here it was as raw as it gets and as foreign and as transformative as you can get. So that's probably the kind of things you would never associate with a business like Koko Black or chocolate. And all of a sudden you're transported somewhere else, really.
Fantastic. And there's been a huge movement in that space since as well. And it's fantastic that you're sharing this experience through food. And sometimes we get an answer from guests that are from that angle as well. So thank you for sharing that one. I'm interested to know if there was any native ingredient in particular that really jumped out at you that maybe you used in one of your products, or maybe there was something that you would have loved to have used but didn't have the capacity to.
Oh, look, I think the most obvious one, which sometimes I still remember doing even in the field, is the green ants. Who would have thought that you would use an actual insect and get that kind of taste and texture? So, of course, eating insects is not unique to Australia. Obviously, it's very very much used through Asia, but generally it's used as almost a protein source. It doesn't taste like much, really. It's more of an ingredient. Whereas green ants it brings this tangy, really strong flavor. And obviously you either do it live or you do it dead, but you essentially get that hit of flavor. And so that's probably the most unique one we've used, all the way to fruit through other things like obviously wattle seeds were far more common, I would say, in their taste profile.
Excellent. Nick, I like to ask from here really why you do what you do and what it is that inspires you to do the work that you do. What really gets you up in the morning and motivates you to complete the personal and professional objectives that you have?
That probably links me quite well into Koko Black. My whole career, I've been about really taking innovation to foods, and innovation in the broader sense of the term, not just new products, but new approach or new perspective or new angles, or bringing things to life that I've never necessarily seen the light before. And that really what drives me in the morning. And I've done that through my career in the white berth, going all the way to academia or global corporate. But at Koko Black, what I find really interesting is taking something as traditional as the artisanal chocolate making that goes back centuries, and being French and obviously being very close to Belgium as well. This is something you grow upon, and it's got its codes, it's got everything. And what I've always loved about Australia since the 20 years that I've been here is that Australia has had a knack across many years to take some of these traditional categories that are massive, they're part of our lives, wine, cheese, coffee, bread, and actually apply what I'd call a new world thinking on it, and saying some of these codes are core to the product and the experience that you get from it. Some of them are just traditions, and we are Australians, we have a different approach to things, and we are going to do it our own way. And they've taken the world by storm. So if you take any one of those categories I just mentioned, wine being obviously the most obvious one, there is such a thing as an Australian wine, and it's redefined in a really new world, contemporary way what it is for the rest of the world. And I find that innovative and very exciting because it opens so many new doors. And in a lot of ways, that's what Koko Black's trying to do with traditional artisan chocolates, and really is getting the creds for it. Same thing as I just explained, bringing green ants into milk chocolate is not something that would necessarily jump in everyone's mind, but that's just one small example of the many different things that Koko does in its own way. But it comes from that leaf. It comes from the Australian manual for innovation, really. And that's what excites me. That's why I do what I do.
And you mentioned the Australian market, which isn't new to you as well, because you've worked with Vitasoy and Baker's Delight previously or before your role at Koko Black. I'm interested even then in the differences you've seen in the Australian market. You mentioned some new versus old world. What is it that makes the Australian market different to other markets? And then more specifically relating to the old world that you talk about and the heritage of these products and processes.
Yeah, so Australia is an interesting market in the sense that it is highly dominated by a very concentrated retail trade, i.e. Woolworths, Coles, and to a lesser degree IGA in terms of food. But you look across multiple business categories, and that's what you find is that because Australia is not a huge market, this, what is it now, 26, 27 million Australian, it's enough to obviously have a good market, but it's not massive. And at the same time, it's in this middle road between New Zealand that is so small that they have to be essentially in the export business first. And Australia, which, is big enough to be a good domestic market, but not quite big enough to create giant players outside of some very narrow exception like mining, for example. And so you end up having essentially very few players at scale. But what's been happening with Australia, and I think it's one thing that's really interesting in the Australian market, is because of the aura that the country has internationally, particularly in Asia, it's got a lot of opportunities to grow and bring that flair that I was just talking about internationally. And what that's driven is the emergence of niche players like Koko Black, but many others, which in turn have actually started to take on the domestic market because Australians have recognized the value of that. So the old world is getting slowly but surely eaten up by the new world, and not necessarily only through international, but actually through domestic. I think about categories like beer, for example. You would have remembered a time where it was just VBs and those type of players absolutely dominating the market, and they're still big. But we all know microbreweries next door or a lot of brands and the fragmentation that's occurred in the market. And that's what I find fascinating in the Australian market, because whilst that's true of many other countries in the world, Australia has a flair to do it, and they take those brands then overseas, are quite successful.
Love that. What an incredible answer. Thank you very much for sharing your insights on that. How did you actually come to do what it is that you do now? So let's talk a little bit about your background and then how you actually came to do that.
Yeah, so I'm a food technologist by degree, and I've essentially had the luxury in France to join Nestlé in the early days of my career. So very quickly, I was quite interested by the business side of the job. Food's always been a passion, but then around it, was about growing into understanding business and how to do it. And I was fortunate enough that Nestlé has an approach to development that's quite open and allowed me to move through various jobs and roles and even countries for a very long period of time. And so I learned my trade by doing, going to production, marketing, all that type of stuff. Still within the logic of a large business and obviously the Nestlé way, call it. So that was my school. Up until I got to Australia and decided that Australia was actually more interesting than Nestlé, and decided to trade one for another. And so I then was really thrown in for the first time into the world to figure out how is the world of business outside of Nestlé. And luckily for me, a lot of the skills and experience translated quite well. So I went through a few experiences of private equity, which are generally people who are looking for breadth. So people who have really multi-skills. And that really gave me my first real foray into business. But very quickly, I narrowed down on what is it I like the most to do. And that is also pretty core to the food category, which, as I say, is my passion. And that was innovation. And really, for the longest period of time, that became then my priority. And that was what drove my career, was to be in positions and in time and space where the main need of a particular job or business was about transforming, really changing things for accelerated growth and mostly through innovation. So that's where I was lucky enough to join companies like Baker's Delight or Kraft Food, which then became Mondelez, and even Monash University to create the Food Innovation Center. So that's been my red thread all the way through to this period to today, where really a lot of the work that is to be done for me at Koko Black is innovation in all aspects of the business. So whether it's business model, whether it's digital pathways or new channels, it is about taking a raw diamond and actually innovating in front of it to be able to expand it and really get growth. That is what I do.
Excellent. And you mentioned there the Food Innovation Centre and that your background is very strong in innovation. I'm interested in where you are looking for new texts and who's on the pulse of food innovation. Where are you drawing that new knowledge from and that growth in the industry?
This is an interesting question, because that's one of those that every food companies, or probably every large companies as well, is struggling with, is where do you find your ideas, right? Where do you find the next stage? And I think a lot of us have a tendency to think incrementally, and therefore you look at what you know and you look at someone else in your competitive set and you say, hey, that's a good idea what they're doing here. Let's do something along those lines. I think what I've learned first is you really look at either opportunities, so really looking at the market, consumer needs, consumer demand, regardless of what category you're talking about. And sometimes I take inspiration from the mobile phone industry or Apple or people like that, and you say, what did they try to do here? And you get underneath into what was the idea, what was the need they were trying to tick. And you bring it back to your context and say, is there something there that actually I can service? Because this clearly is something people are looking for. Or sometimes it is about taking new technology or new ventures in the market and actually saying, this is really cool, really innovative, and actually taking that very lightly and look at what it could add to your business and playing with that laterally, because it's very rare that any of these ideas actually apply directly. So you've really got to play around. So I think the best sources of these innovation then become where you narrow down to some sort of an attribute that is opened by that technology, and you say, if only I could do this, what does it mean for a business like mine or for my products? What could I do with it? It's still a hit and miss sometimes, but then the next step, probably the most important for me, is that you have to play with it. You've actually got to do something. And that is something probably I learned outside of the larger companies, because larger companies, obviously, they are managing risks and they're managing assets. So you don't take a chance until you've analyzed and proven and done business cases to be sure. Where in smaller companies, you can't afford to do that. Things go far too quickly for you. So you actually learn by doing, learn by failing, and really you test and learn. You just constantly work with that and you throw away the bits you don't like and you keep building the ones you like. So that's probably the other piece, is getting inspiration, but then quickly taking it into your business and say, let me try that. What could I do with this?
Yeah, thank you for that, Nick, as well. And in your answer there, it demonstrates quite clearly that you do think very broadly and laterally, as you mentioned there, across different industries to draw that inspiration. I'm glad I asked the question because it's a space that you have worked a lot in. You have quite deep knowledge base around. Thank you for sharing that. And it's quite clear that way that you think laterally, even in the first couple of answers. And then in that one, it's what I actually try to do through this particular program is to show people that there are ideas and concepts and questions from industries laterally or adjacent. They could be even starkly different. And you can draw on those concepts, even the same questions that people are asking, and bring them into the work that you do in your business, whatever industry that you're in. So Hospopreneurs is much more broad than just hospitality, that's for sure. So thank you for that answer, Nick. Nick, along that innovation road, I know that you've been testing some new technology during COVID as well with another business that's really worked for you through that. Tell us a little bit more about what that business is, what it does, and what it really allowed you to do through that time.
If you recall at the time, so I'm talking second lockdown after not the euphoria, but almost we're back in May, June, and all of a sudden, not only we were not back, but we actually completely closed Victoria, which is obviously our home base, and starting to realize that we were in this for quite some time and didn't have any of the answers, really. It was hard enough to get through that first lockdown and really be caught unawares. But the second time, we just didn't have a feel for how long it would last, what would be the impact, how we would manage it. And so it became quite apparent to us that not only COVID was obviously a risk for our own people and the safety of our people, but even a business risk, because you could get all of a sudden a place of work or a place of business where COVID could come in and literally close you overnight. And we are a business that's obviously, like a lot of retail business, highly dependent on cash flow and therefore can't just wait it out, even with JobKeeper and the great support that the government had offered to us. So one of the things we went to is to say, well, surely there's a way that we can minimize damage if ever that was to happen. And despite all the precautionary measure, we get COVID into the workplace. And we came across this technology called Contact Haro, which is essentially an RF technology where you get a card assigned to yourself, and that card records essentially when it gets within 1.5 meter of another card for more than a minute. And then you can define how many minutes you want to consider a close contact. So in the event that someone does get COVID, you would be able to instantly know who were the exact people that were actually at risk from being a close contact, rather than everybody who was in the workplace at that time. So it's a little bit like if you apply the concept of traceability to a quality incident on a product and you're trying to narrow it down, one, to go fast and make sure it's safe for everybody, but second, to obviously reduce the damage financially by only excluding the products or in the case of COVID, the people that actually were at risk and not the rest. And if you think about it, for us, the biggest time of the year for our business is Christmas. And we were right bang in winter in the process of getting ready for Christmas, because you have to manufacture and be ready a month in advance. So we didn't take 2 seconds to think about it and really implemented that technology straight away into our business. And it gave us not only the ability, fortunately we didn't have any COVID case, but it could have happened, but it gave us the peace of mind to actually go hard and keep our business running, because we thought even if the worst happens, we will be able to manage and operate, which I know, having talked to a lot of my fellow CEOs, some business couldn't and decided to also make a pass almost on Christmas risks because they weren't sure. And I don't know if you've been around in retail at Christmas time this year, but I can tell you for a fact that the offer at Christmas was probably far less interesting than it's been in prior Christmas because there were a number of brands who just didn't go too hard at preparing for it. So the choice was far reduced. So that was not our case. And that's why we were very successful at Christmas, I think.
Thank you very much for sharing that story as well, Nick, and I'm really glad Koko Black has been able to survive through that time. I know we've been talking a lot about innovation. I want to stick on that topic just for another couple of questions. I like to play around in that space from here, and I'm really glad we've been able to get into it quite quickly. It's something I like to open up earlier on in the show if I can. What are you learning about or exploring at the moment? This is kind of a double-barrel question. I'd like to know where you're innovating. This doesn't have to be the business. It can be yourself personally, things that you're learning about or exploring.
Yeah, so look, I think there is no doubt that through the last 12 months, we've accelerated our thought process and innovation in the digital world, really. So obviously, it's a market-wide. Everybody is doing more of it, and it's obviously coming from a few years. But again, I think a lot of it is mechanical, or we are all doing the same things, opening through delivery platforms and those kind of things, which is great. But that's, as I said, something that probably is more market-wide. So a lot of the innovation we've been focusing on is what are we about and where can some of these innovations or new technology augment what we do and actually accelerate our brand progression or our business progression because they fit. They're not just the new thing that everybody is looking to do, say Uber Eats or something like that. They're actually things that expand our own identity. And a good example I can give you of that has been personalization. Very quickly, obviously, last year we had to pivot, even though we all hate the term, but we've had to really focus on how could our online e-commerce business pick up where the retail stores couldn't for a period of time. And how could we offer that? So outside of the obvious, which is, as I said, finding ways to deliver quicker and all those kind of things. Koko Black's always been a gifting business. That's what a lot of the purchases in our stores are for. People buy our products as gifts for others. And therefore, the idea of personalization as customization is quite natural. We tend to do it in our stores by offering you the ultimate possibility of customizing the content of which product you're picking up, etc. But online gave us the opportunity to also personalize it. By that, I mean the ability to dress it up with a sleeve that was personalized for the person you were sending it to, giving them gift cards or greeting cards, and actually adding a touch of your own personal views and messages to the customer. And so we've worked on technology using people like Rico and Spiff and really collaborated to bring this to market quickly. Matter of fact, for Valentine's Day, we've just added video messages. So you can actually send a Koko Black chocolate through that you buy through our e-com platform and attach a video message for the person you're sending it to, which is the ultimate personalization, really. And so that's a good example of how we're thinking about how we bring innovation. So there's obviously in food always an element of creating new products and new flavors and that kind of thing. But we think actually there's a layer that's a lot more about what's your role as a brand, as a business, as a product in the life of your consumers, and how can you build that by leveraging innovation or creating things that they would like to have and have never been available before. That's how we think about it.
To build on that then, what would you like to be available that isn't yet? Where do you think things should be pushing forward? And you might not be pushing forward in that space yet. Where do you think things should?
Yeah, look, I think there's still gaps. We spend a lot of energy and time, and I think it's still hard to work on sustainability, environmental solutions. If you think actually even through COVID, we've added packaging, we've added sanitizers. There's a number of things we've added into the chain that probably are not going in the right direction. So I think the sustainability element still requires a lot more breakthrough and innovation than it has so far. And that would help business like ours to do the right thing because there's an appetite at our end. It's still difficult to find solutions. So that's probably one place I would say still need a lot of work. Streamlining also probably some of the industry we have in the country. Again, same thing linking to the packaging industry. I think we're still quite constrained on that front, and seeing more development in those areas would actually help a lot of business.
Absolutely, Nick. ESG and the social component of that and sustainable aspect to a lot of these industries is absolutely at the forefront of conversation now. And, whether that's been catalyzed by COVID, maybe not. There's certainly been conversations on the oil price and the travel industry. It's affected that even more. I'd like to know, Nick, if you think that there's a future in these products that you've added, because obviously it adds complexity to the business. If you're selling hand sanitizers and all these other additional components, are they going to stick around, or do you think that we're going to return back to normal?
No, actually, I don't think we'll return fully back to normal. I think there's always going to be a hangover or certainly a degree of stickiness to some of these changes. I think it's going to be hard to see these go. I think, if anything, there could be less pervasive evolution of some of these needs. At some point, we were all looking at QR codes and having to sign in and a few of those things. And I suspect we will see innovation in that space to make it less invasive, less pervasive, much like we're seeing in airports. Going to the scanner instead of the full search, the metal detectors and a few of those. So I suspect some of these annoyances are going to create innovation to make them smoother and easier. And obviously then they'll go in the back of our mind. And that's where maybe we think we go back to normal, but I think it's go back to less annoyance in the process as opposed to them not being there. That's probably what I'm thinking. Even reflecting on one of those things is where we were all thinking, how do you do menus? For a period, we were just having the QR codes and that popping up on your phone and ordering from that when we reopened, if you recall. That doesn't work very well. I don't know what your experience is, but from my perspective, this is something that's really not as good as what we had before with a simple menu. But yet that technology should actually be able to give us something far more interesting. So I think we'll see innovation on that front that will take this new level and just say, I can deliver an experience that's at least as good or better than it used to be and still do this. And I think that's what we're going to see. As an early adopter, I'm actually looking forward to it because sometimes I think the early adopter is the winner. So you've got to watch for the signs.
Yes, and what an excellent way to mention some of our previous guests on the show as well. A lot of businesses that were working in that space prior to the coronavirus in hospitality tech that I've spoken with over the last few years. It's been interesting watching them thrive throughout the coronavirus. I know that we've focused a lot on COVID. I try to stay away from COVID on the show, but it's been cool having your perspective on innovation, how things have really changed with that background of yours as well. Maybe to focus just a little bit more before we get to right to the latter end of the episode on innovation and creativity. Is there something that you do with the background that you have thinking in the way that you do? Is there a way that you inspire your staff or create an environment and an ecosystem for people to be thinking creatively, to be developing these new ideas?
Yeah, that's actually a very good point because that's always something you wrestle in. You don't want to be, there's only 5 people who are allowed to innovate type mode because once the NPD or the new product development manager or something like that, you also don't want to make it so bureaucratic, a suggestion box that actually nothing ever happens because no one follows up or do on that. So I think it becomes down to a willingness and attitude to do it on the fly, where people feel like they can say, hey, why don't we do blah? And essentially you're allowed them to have a crack at doing it. Obviously, it's all risk assessed, as in you don't play with things that are either safety induced or would, if they fail, would make the business collapse. But most people do have common sense on that stuff. So you would absolutely listen to ideas and say, yeah, why don't you go and have a crack at that? And then you support that. So I think it's far more organic and fluid that I know for having worked a lot of in corporate, often first thing people think in those companies, we used to say, oh, let's try that, open innovation, etc. But it would ultimately always result into a big process. And you don't want that because essentially that's the best way to kill it. So I think you got to accept that it's fluid and hazy and it's uncomfortable for people who have a black and white mind, but you have to let it be fluid and then just know when to tighten it up. So it is one of those where you behave like that. And that's what I try and do is because I'm at the contact of our staff a lot daily. And if they come up with something that has merit, we just go and test and try it. And if it works, but it's not perfect, that's when we then tighten it up. We say it's working, but now we need to make it sustainable or a process around it. But you don't do that up front. You do that upon testing.
How do you foster that and support that? I know you're saying about doing it on the fly. There mustn't be an internal program or anything that you have established there to do it. Is it a matter of just talking to your staff saying, hey, if you've got ideas, I'm ready to implement them?
Correct. And you do it yourself. That's the other thing. So I think you have to lead by example on that stuff, but it's then the rest is an attitude first. So obviously you showing that's okay to do that. And second, obviously allowing others to do it. And as part of that, obviously balancing out how often you do these things. And sometimes when you're really busy, you're really busy. You just need to focus on the essential, but there's a lot of times where you can't do these things. So I actually really believe it's just attitude and culture, and the culture comes from that.
Fantastic. Nick, I've got two more questions for you today. The penultimate one here is, what's your biggest challenge right now?
The unpredictability of the market, whether it's because of external factors like Western Australia this weekend, pull the rabbit out of the hat and just say, hey, we're going to be locked down for 5 days and we're shutting in 2 hours after one case, or it's actually how people are actually internalizing that differently across the country. At one point, Victoria was obsessed with the risk. Now it feels it's not so much Victoria as it is New South Wales. And so it's this constant unpredictability. It's adding a lot of factors to what you think about as a business, also to the feeling, the attitudes in your own staff who are riding those waves more or less swimmingly, call it. And so I think that's the biggest challenge is everybody has a hard time to read or project themselves forward. It's probably not as bad as it has been, or if I compare myself being French to Europe, where we were probably, call it 6 months ago in the core of the winter lockdown, where there was zero perspective. But it is this time where you're thinking, well, we should be okay. We're open. There's no coronavirus. There's no other environments. And yet the market is just moving up, down, sideways, pretty much every week in different fashions. We had a fantastic Christmas, like probably something I did not expect as well. And then straight after that, we had a terrible January. And so it's really difficult to think, how do I manage that? So you have to stay extremely attentive and flexible, really. But that is something that is difficult, obviously, at an individual level, as well as a business level, when you actually try and would like to be able to project yourself so you can plan, think, take some chances, whereas you really navigate with a very close view at the moment. And that's probably the biggest challenge I have.
Is there anything that you've found that you can do to stay flexible and stay agile and be able to adapt? I know Koko Black, being the size that you're at, you would be able to adapt to some things, but you would be slow moving for others. How do you maintain the nimble nature of business at that size?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and something that potentially becomes a strength over time, but you do try to figure out what is the core of what you do and how are you able to assemble differently. So it's actually very much an innovation technique, is you don't have to do something new at 100%. You can recycle 80% of a lot of things. It's the last 20% that matter in terms of how it appears or when it comes through. And I think if you apply that logic to a lot of the things you do, you try and ensure that at the core, you've protected things like raw material, packaging material supply, and things like this. But you hold very lightly how you're going to assemble them at the end. You increase flexibility. For example, we took the chance during COVID to train a lot of our staff being multi-skilled, because we never knew where that was going to restart and how it was going to restart. So we thought if we have fluidity on where we can put people, then all of a sudden we'll have far more answers, no matter what the question is. And so I think that's the approach we have to take, and we're taking it more and more. It's just human nature. We don't really want to change everything we do all the time because it's uncomfortable and it's tiring. But I think that's the best answer at the moment, is we focus on what are the things that we need to make sure allow us to operate. And then we keep everything as quite flexible so we could actually assemble them in multiple ways.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Nick. Last question for you today is, who would you like to hear on the show?
If you had that kind of pool, I would love to hear from Josh Friedenberg and how he's actually thinking at the macro level for the economy. Because when you think about what I just described, I'm just absolutely puzzled and amazed on how you can even forecast yourself in the future and provide a structure around the businesses. But that's probably a big ask.
Absolutely, a very tough place to be making those decisions at the moment. Yeah.
I would love to hear from Kogan, the new e-com giant, really, who seem to have, obviously, they were a business that was obviously existing and relatively strong, but they seem to have exploded in the last 12 months, obviously, on the back of COVID. But just really hearing and understanding how is this whole new approach of consumers to e-commerce, what has it really changed? What is sticking? Because obviously there are things that will happen at a certain time because there's no other options. And then people have choice again. And I'll be really keen to hear what do they think is going to unfold over the next 12 to 18 months. Because for a lot of businesses like ours, it would be extremely insightful to understand where they think things are going to actually move, what's going to really stay part of the ongoing behavior of the consumers and what they're seeing have changed, really, as opposed to be just a point in time.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your answers today, Nick. It's been a pleasure having you on. Really insightful, really interesting. You've got a fascinating background. Thank you for sharing it on the program today.
Thank you very much, James. That was a pleasure.
This program is hosted by James Henderson, with technical production by Jake Olver. Voiceovers were by Angus Brennan and Shim Phelan. Thanks to our distribution team, and a special thanks to you for tuning in every week. This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.